Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. How are you? Good? Everybody good? Got enough caffeine and sweets? Okay, nice to see you. My name's Larry Swatuk. I'm a professor in the School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development, long-standing member of the Water Institute, standing in for Director Professor Brouwer, who's not here. He's away on mission somewhere. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce a longtime friend of mine, Professor David McDonald. We go back at least a couple of decades or more. I know that's hard to believe, we look so youthful. And before I introduce Professor McDonald, I'd like to start with the traditional territorial acknowledgement. And I just want to say something to especially to the international students, but also the Canadian students, who probably puzzle over this land acknowledgement. And I once asked Albert Marshall. Albert Marshall is a Mi'kmaq elder. He's out in Eskasoni on Cape Breton Island. And I worked with Albert quite a bit. And Albert is the inventor of the idea of two-eyed seeing, the blending Indigenous knowledge with Western science. And doing things with students in Eskasoni. I once asked Albert, what's the utility of this land acknowledgement? And Albert said, it's very simple. You can't say you don't know. Right? So there is utility to the land acknowledgement because you can't claim ignorance anymore. So the land acknowledgement that I want to read to you is the one that we use at the University of Waterloo. University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land granted to 6 nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within the Indigenous Initiatives offices. All right, let me get into my introduction to Professor McDonald now. So Professor McDonald, David McDonald, is a professor in the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's University and director of the Municipal Services Project, a global research initiative that unites academics, activists, and practitioners engaged in debates around equitable and sustainable public services. The group has published several books, at least one of which is open access, Public Water and COVID-19, Dark Clouds and Silver Linings, which I happen to have right in front of me. So here's a hard copy that we can pass around. There's a few others here from his Municipal Services Project production that we can pass around. You can have a look at. He's kindly donating this to us, and we will make them available for students. I'm sure the library must have at least, but you always can have a second copy, right? Dr. McDonald's research revolves around debates over public versus private service delivery with a focus on water, electricity, and health care, but encompasses a broad spectrum of related questions on urbanization, environmental justice, and uneven development. His most recent book is Meanings of Public and the Future of Public Services, and he's going to talk to us today about what's public about public water. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, the blink of an eye, and it's a couple of decades later. It's quite something. It's amazing, really. I'm going to, there's some of our books here. I'm going to just hand them around. You can have a look. If they could end up back here so that they can be in the library at some point. Almost all of our material is available on our website. Journal articles, we sort of violate copyright to the extent that we can to make stuff freely available on our website, but some of the stuff is open access as well. So Municipal Services Project, please have a look, and we've got popular videos, all kinds of material there related to the work we do on public services. So I'm going to tell you a bit about how I started my career, and this is in fact how I met Larry, and actually I didn't bring a copy of a book that Larry contributed a chapter to years ago about, called The Age of Commodity and Water Privatization in Southern Africa, where I spent many, many years doing work on a wide range of services. But I spent probably the first half of my career critiquing privatization. What's wrong with privatization and its various manifestations? And I say various manifestations because, you know, for those of you who aren't familiar with this debate, how many of you are on the sort of science side of water out of curiosity? And the sort of social science side of water? Okay, so I mean, it's one of the things I love about water, and I've actually just taught a new course this year at Queen's called Living Lake Ontario, and about sort of place-based education and you know, what that means to be living on Lake Ontario. And so I had a lot of science people come through, and we have a similar water institute at Queen's. But there's not a huge amount of communication often between, you know, people that do the important work in chemistry and pharmacology and toxicology and so on, and the social sciences. So bear with me if you're familiar with this, but you know, we often think, and this sort of gets at the heart of what I'm talking about today, public-private, some sort of, you know, simple binary. In fact, it's very complicated, and it's this end of the spectrum here that we often think about, you know, outright divestiture of water. And in fact, there's been very little full divestiture, full privatization of water. Really, it's only Chile and the UK that have privatized their water, sold them lock, stock, and barrel to the private sector. Almost everything that happens in privatization happens in this sphere here, around public-private partnerships. And that can be, you know, short-term management contracts right up to 75-year joint ventures. So we've spent a long time criticizing this stuff, and I'm going to talk about this end of the spectrum here a bit too, about corporatization, because the other thing is that what may be public in name is increasingly private in the way that it operates, ideologically, institutionally, financially. And so we spend a lot of time looking at this end of this so-called public spectrum, and the creeping kind of commercialization, marketization, and more recently financialization of public services. So at that end of the corporatization spectrum is basically everything in the world now with the water services has been corporatized. The sort of the old welfare era model of combining public services, so you have a health department, a water department, a transportation department, all under sort of one umbrella, has gone to the wayside. And in the neoliberal era, we've seen a dramatic increase in the corporatization of water services. And what that means essentially is that we have ring-fenced these entities. So if you think, and I'm sure Waterloo's the same, there's a public utility that does water services, and it's often combined with sanitation, but it's a managerially, legally, and financially separate entity from other government departments. And so in Kingston, we have Kingston Utilities, and they're owned entirely by the City of Kingston, but they operate independently at arm's length. And the main reason this was done was to financially ring-fence public services so that you know how much it costs to actually deliver a drop of water. When that was combined with other public services, it was impossible to separate out, well, what was that truck for? What did that manager do? Now, when you ring-fence these things into separate legal entities where all the accounting is done separately, you know exactly what your costs are, right? Now, corporatization is nothing new. The Romans did corporatization, the Soviets did corporatization, the Nazis did corporatization. There's nothing inherently neoliberal about corporatization. But over the last 30 years, we've seen this move towards a more market-oriented way of thinking about public services. We have the same thing with hospitals in Canada. Most hospitals are sort of standalone cost recovery units. And so it's that push towards cost recovery combined with that kind of managerial capacity and accounting capacity to understand the financial bottom line of services that has really transformed public services today. And so we see this kind of increasingly commercialized behaviors, profit-oriented, unequal investments based on, you know, how is that going to affect the organization's bottom line. Utility managers are often remunerated based on the financial performance of their public utility. And then there's also concerns with sort of lack of accountability and who's making decisions, et cetera, when you have this arm's length entity, because it's not directly under the control of elected officials. So this book cover here, which is not there, but it's available on our website, was a piece we did years ago about South Africa. And at the end of the apartheid era, the ANC under Nelson Mandela was very clear, we are not going to privatize water. We're not going to privatize electricity, and they haven't. But they moved very rapidly and very aggressively towards a corporatization model. And so the work we were doing was looking at the impact of what corporatization has done. And essentially, you had a market-oriented sort of strategy, and this publicly owned entities across the country were aggressively cutting off people's water that couldn't afford to pay for it. They were underinvesting in low-income areas. And so, our critique of this was that, driven by this kind of cost recovery mandate, these public entities were acting very much like private corporations. And in fact, they were even more aggressive than private corporations because they kind of had the moral authority of state ownership. And particularly under Nelson Mandela in the early days, there was this pressure to say to people, look, you need to pay your water bills, because if you don't, we're not going to be able to invest in other public services elsewhere, et cetera. So this is a continuing crisis in South Africa. There was a conference earlier this year about this topic, and it was like, back to the future. It was as if 25 years had not passed. The exact same dynamics are happening in South Africa around aggressive cost recovery by a public entity. We also have, in many cases, and I'll use South Africa example again, Rand Water, which is a public entity, bulk water provider in the Johannesburg area, goes out and gets contracts in other parts of the continent. And so they were running water services in Accra in Ghana for many years. And they were seen as a private for-profit company by Ghanaians who said, we don't want this. This is a form of privatization. So here you have a public entity going out and acting like a private corporation to try and make a profit. And so where does that line, what is public, what is private, and where do these these blurry lines end and start? And corporatization, I would argue, has been a huge part of the confusion associated with that. We get the same thing in Canada. Use the example of Manitoba Hydro. Anyone from Manitoba? Curiosity? So Manitoba Hydro, publicly owned. The management of Manitoba Hydro has been fighting privatization in that country. They want to argue on behalf of keeping it public. They also have an international wing that goes out and gets private contracts. They have a contract right now in Nigeria to privatize their high transmission lines. So they're arguing that they're public at home and arguing against privatization at home, but then they go out and act like a private for-profit company elsewhere in the world. And I could go on and on and on about this kind of strange, complicated relationship. So we decided to say, okay, we know what we don't like in the way services are done. We're against privatization. And frankly, a lot of this privatization stuff is just so easy to criticize. Kind of got bored, kind of got depressed, and said, okay, now we need to shift gears here and say, what are we actually for? So, because we all know that not all public services are good. 85% of the world's fresh water supplies are publicly owned. Almost all of those are corporatized, as I've just mentioned. But we also know that public water services are not great. I mean, the numbers are staggering. And we are nowhere near meeting the Sustainable Development Goals on water, and particularly on sanitation, right? I mean, my title is Water today. It's sexy to talk about water. Nobody likes to talk about shit, but it's by far the more important of these things, right? And we are miles behind on sanitation goals with SDGs. And public water operators and sanitation water operators have failed dramatically on this front. And there's all kinds of ways that you can criticize public water operators in terms of middle-class bias, racist behavior, poor quality delivery, corruption, lack of investment, opaque decision-making. The list goes on and on and on. So I'm not here to defend public water operators simply because they're public. That is a serious problem. And even here in Canada, right? You go to many First Nations communities. Just down the road from us in Kingston, Tyendinaga First Nation, they are still, parts of that community are still on boil water advisories. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to think of that. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, well, what is it that we're defending? So if we're opposed to privatization and we're in support of public, what kind of public are we in support of? And I've met many First Nations people who say, you want me to defend what? You know, I don't have health care. I don't have public water. I don't have public electricity. So, you know, what is it that you're supporting and defending here? And that's really what we have done for the last 15 years as a project is what kind of public are we interested in? And how do we identify those things? How do we measure those things, et cetera? So what does it mean to be pro-public? And this is a very different thing, and I'll talk a little later in the talk here about pro-public versus anti-privatization. Anti-privatization is pretty straightforward. We know what those arguments are. To me, it's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. It's so easy to criticize privatization. Being pro-public and articulating what that means, and what that means in a place like Canada versus Ghana versus Indonesia, is much, much more complicated. And so we're still trying to find our way on this terrain of what that means to be pro-public. And I'll talk a bit about the research that we're doing and that others are doing in this talk. One thing I will say is that it's not about going back to some kind of mythological golden era of welfarism. Not that that ever existed in most parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but to the extent that it did exist in North America and Europe, we know that these things were also deeply problematic for Indigenous people, for racialized people, for women, for any kind of marginalized group. And so it's not about business as usual. It's not going back to some mythological notion of public as if it was perfect. So it's challenging the kinds of things that are deeply problematic in our public services. And I will say, this has gotten me into a lot of trouble over the years because people will say, how can you criticize public? You're just sort of handing it over to the pro-privateers. And I'm always like, there's no point in defending something that's indefensible. We need to fight both of these battles at the same time. Fight against privatization while at the same time saying, this is what we want, and identifying the problematic forms of public services. So that in a nutshell is what we've been doing as a project for the last 15 years, is critically engaging with what public services mean. And we do cover a wide range of services: waste management, healthcare, electricity. I'm going to specifically focus on water today. But of course, these things are all integrated. You can't have a fantastic service in one sector and have it fail elsewhere, right? So you might have a good public water service, but if you don't have good public health and good public education and housing and transportation, et cetera. So it's a very broad-based front that we have to think about. And I actually have a colleague, Eric Swingadow, maybe you've heard the name, one of the biggest names in water research. He always says, if you're interested in doing something about water, stop talking about water. Because if you get embroiled in that one sectoral kind of focus, you lose sight of the way these things are integrated and work with one another, and how we build a kind of public service culture more broadly, institutional, financial, political. So water is important, yes, but we can't lose sight of how it's integrated into a broader range of public service delivery. Oops. I may not have time to talk about this today, but I'm happy to answer questions on it about measuring performance. And I've actually thought a lot about the way we benchmark services. And particularly in the water sector, this sort of benchmarking model was developed by the private sector, brought into the public sector. And virtually every public water operator in the world uses some version of a kind of performance benchmarking system. There's competing models out there, but they're all pretty similar, and they're quite complex and very commercial in their orientation. And so, I'm always saying to public water operators, okay, so you want to be different, but then you measure yourself using these benchmarking criteria that were adopted by the private sector and are very commercial in their orientation. So that, how do you know if you're doing something differently if you're using the exact same measurements for the way that you perform? And just to give you one example, one of the kind of key measurements that's often used is the number of workers per household connection, as if somehow reducing that to 1,000 connections per worker is somehow going to make for a better service. So it's this very sort of narrow, efficiency-oriented benchmarking model that's used in the water sector around the world. Anywhere. I mean, you go to Brazil, you go to Jakarta, they all use basically the same kind of criteria, and it's deeply problematic. So I'm arguing that if we're going to talk about being a different kind of service, how do we measure that? And so one of the things I don't think it's one of the books here, but we've sort of developed a kind of an alternative framework for things that we want to measure that aren't really picked up in some of the mainstream accounting sort of benchmarking models. And so we can talk about that if anyone's interested in this sort of alternative benchmarking framework. So one of the first sort of clusters of research we did was we said, okay, are there good examples of corporatization out there? As I said, there's nothing inherently neoliberal about the corporatization model. And there's good reasons to create arm's length public water operators. Not the least of which is that you can separate it out from short-term political decision-making by politicians who might want to sort of weaponize or politicize water in ways that are not, socially just or environmentally just, right? We're going to deny you water access because we don't like you, or we're going to give you water access because we want your votes, that kind of thing. So there's a good political reason for creating that kind of arm's length accountability. Similarly with financial accounting, there's nothing wrong with knowing what it actually costs you to deliver water services. It makes for better decision making. But if you commercialize that and you incentivize managers to behave in such a way that that's the most important thing, that you break even or that you make a profit, what does that do to the kind of decision-making process? So this book has about 7 or 8 case studies of what we try and do is identify what we think are relatively positive examples of something and then talk about them critically. A colleague of mine from Uruguay always says, there's no such thing as perfect public services. There's no chemically pure publicness. And that is because every place is different. Geographically, politically, culturally, institutionally. There's no ideal notion of publicness. So it's always a question of, what are they doing well? What could they do a bit differently? And so, again, I often get myself into trouble by looking at good examples and then, reaming off all the problems associated with them. But we're not going to move forward if we're not open and honest about the kinds of things that we see out there. But we do identify good examples, and I have up here, for example, OSC. And this is the Uruguayan national water operator. Uruguay is a very small country of about 3 million people, and so they have a single national water operator. It was privatized, renationalized, and is an example of a really well-run, very progressive, and interconnected example of corporatization. So we did a case study of this, and we looked at it, and we said, hey, here's the kinds of things that OSCE is doing really well. Here's where they've got some problems, et cetera. And the government has since changed, and some of the progressive stuff has been undermined by a more conservative government. But it's an example of a more positive way that you can run things. So we're not saying that corporatization is inherently a bad thing. I think there's a lot of good reasons that you would corporatize water, but there's different ways of doing it. It doesn't have to be commercialized and marketized in the way that most neoliberal-oriented public entities have done with corporatization. Another field of work we've been looking at is around remunicipalization. One of the ugliest academic words out there, but it's basically cities and towns, although it has happened at provincial and national levels. I just mentioned Uruguay's water operator was renationalized. And this is a very big trend. I'm going to show you a graph in a minute. Hundreds and hundreds of municipalities around the world have remunicipalized their water, their electricity, their healthcare, their transportation services. After years, if not decades, of experimentation with privatization, citizens, politicians, bureaucrats have said, this isn't working. And I actually do a lot of work now in the States around remunicipalization. They've actually, along with France, have remunicipalized more water services than any country in the world. And it's often by very conservative Republican-led administrations at the municipal level who just say, this is not working. This is actually really expensive. Profit-taking, CEO salaries, et cetera. And they're now remunicipalizing, and in many cases buying up for the first time, because they were always in private hands, public water operators. Hundreds and hundreds of them. I have a database of at least 450 municipalities in the United States which has done this. And this isn't for ideological left-wing reasons. Some of these people actually believe in privatization. But they said it's failed. It actually isn't more efficient. In fact, it's more costly. And we lose kind of control over this public good, and we don't have, it's harder to manage our watersheds, and for a whole range of reasons that you're familiar with. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in this field. But again, I get myself into trouble with colleagues of mine who just, any form of remunicipalization is good because it's public. And I have up here Eau de Paris, fantastic example, right? Remunicipalized after 25 years of going back and forth with Suez and Veolia, the two biggest water operators in the world, which are now merged. January 1st, 2010, it was now public. It used to be private, and it was suddenly public. Most Parisians didn't even know it had happened. And so there's lots and lots of examples around the world of this. Some of them have not been so good. Some remunicipalizations have been done for very problematic reasons. In Hungary, for example, under the Orbán government, they've basically made them public so that the central government has more control over water, and they've sort of weaponized water in some respects. And he's sort of re-privatizing it out to some of his crony friends. There's lots of autocratic ways that these things have been done. Some have been remunicipalized and then heavily commercialized. And the World Bank has sort of pushed some of that in Uganda and Tanzania, for example. Privatization failed. The World Bank came in and said, you should remunicipalize, and then forced governments to make these very commercial, marketized, publicly owned entities. So again, there's nothing inherently good about remunicipalization, but this collection of essays and many others, and lots of this stuff on our website, again, we try and look at examples of remunicipalization. What went well, what didn't go so well. We've done some stuff on failed remunicipalizations, et cetera. I'm increasingly doing work on financing remunicipalization, which is a very expensive thing. Just did an interview last week with a water operator in Monterey, California. They're buying their water services back. It's $500 million. Where do you get $500 million in this day and age of austerity, right? So, trying to understand what's happening and just how public are these remunicipalized entities. So, what I'm really doing here is just sort of flagging for you the kind of research and complicated nature of, again, what do we mean by public water? And I would say this is a fascinating area of research and lots of scope for more dynamic research, particularly in the global south. Most of the research has been European and North American focused. This book, actually, we have a case study of Malaysia, Argentina, Tanzania, and another one in the global south I've just forgotten. So this is a couple of years old now. A group that I work with in Amsterdam, Transnational Institute, has been tracking this. And these are just documented cases. You can see a lot of it's been in Europe, but it's a global phenomenon around the world of remunicipalizations. And the water sector here, you can see it's been over 300 cases of it. And this is, I know it's outdated because there's over 400 cases in the US alone. So just trying to keep on top of what's happening. And it's been very dynamic because a lot of these long-term water contracts, which came into play in the 1990s and the early neoliberal era, are now coming to an end. So I know in Spain, for example, there's at least 90 long-term water contracts which are going to be coming up for renewal in the next 5 to 10 years. And there's a very dynamic debate in Spain. Spain's one of the most interesting places to watch the remunicipalization debate unfold. There's a copy of this book going around. It's available we were trying to understand what's happening with public water operators during COVID-19. And just the sheer logistics of how do you get people out into the field with closures, right? But a lot of public water operators were also facing a financial crisis, right? People couldn't afford to pay their water. Water consumption went down, particularly on the industrial and commercial side of activities. So a lot of public water operators were suddenly in a kind of financial crisis. And if you're corporatized and you're under pressure to break even or make a profit, this was a very serious problem for a lot of global public water operators around the world. So we, again, just said, well, let's see what's going on out there. So there's about, I think, 20 or 25 case studies in this book from Colombia through to Germany and other places, trying to understand, again, better examples of, what is it that a public water operator could do during COVID-19 differently than private water operators. And we knew that a lot of private water operators were very aggressively shutting off people's water supplies to try and save money during COVID-19. The worst thing you could do, right? Wash your hands while my water's cut off, right? Public water operators are doing the same thing, though, again, to deal with their financial crisis. So how did good public water operators deal with COVID-19? And there's some really fascinating stories in here about frontline managers and workers who were incredibly creative in thinking about how they were going to deal with these things. So again, trying to get the storyline out there that public water operators are not always corrupt and inefficient and uninterested and opaque. There's lots of really positive stories out there of public water operators. My most recent work has been around public banks and how they finance public services. We're focusing now, for the most part, on public water. And out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of a public bank? Okay. Not surprising. We really don't have them in North America. We used to have lots of them. They were all privatized or shut down in the neoliberal era. We do have a couple. We have the Export Development Corporation, the Business Development Corporation, which are essentially subsidizing private industry. And we recently, 5 years ago, have the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is not really a bank, but it's kind of a bank. But its entire mandate is to privatize. So their goal is to leverage $4 or $5 of private money for every dollar of public money. And so they were pushing Mapleton, Ontario, for example, to privatize their water. So there's nothing inherently good or bad about public banks. Some of them are deeply problematic. The Russian invasion of the Ukraine is being financed in part by Russian state-owned public banks. But what we were looking for is examples of public state-owned banks that are actually doing interesting things in financing public water. So in the Netherlands, for example, there's a bank called the Water Bank, and its entire mandate is to finance publicly owned water infrastructure in the Netherlands. And it does that at the cheapest possible rates you can finance things at, because it's a AAA credit rating, not technically backed by the government, which is one of the weaknesses of that particular bank. But there's lots of really interesting stuff. So in the Nordic countries, which I did a chapter for in this book, all of the municipalities in Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark collectively own a public bank that has the sovereign backing of the national government. So again, they have AAA credit ratings. They go out, borrow money on the international markets at the lowest possible rates you can borrow money, and then they lend that to their member institutions, which are the municipalities, with almost no real need for a lot of paperwork, etc. So every municipality in these countries, and it's all entirely public water in these Scandinavian countries, has no problem getting access to finance for infrastructure that they need. And so one of the biggest gaps with water infrastructure we know, and this is certainly true in North America, is money, right? We are billions of dollars in deficit in Ontario on sanitation infrastructure alone. And the approach we've taken here is to borrow money from the private sector. And it costs us billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars more, to finance our public infrastructure through private banks, and increasingly through other private financial institutions, private equity funds, et cetera. This is the financialization of our public services. And so what we're interested in is, what role could public banks play in this regard? And again, there are a lot of really bad examples of public banks out there for all kinds of reasons. But there's some really fantastic examples out there as well. But there's virtually no research. This is the first time there's ever been sustained case study research on public banks funding public water operators. And we're in the midst right now of putting together a collection in the Global South with a number of case studies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and that'll be coming out next year. So I'll just conclude by talking about how we're going to build a kind of global pro-public movement. And it's not easy. Unlike the anti-privatization movement, which is basically unified, it took a long time, but the anti-privatization movement has been very effective. And it's basically the same set of arguments anywhere you go in the world and almost any sector you look at. And it's an effective argument. That's not true with public services. How do you define a good public services in different places? How do you compare healthcare with water? It's a much more complicated terrain. So there's very different viewpoints on what constitutes a good public services. There's also a reluctance to be critical of public services, as I've mentioned before, and that I think is deeply problematic. And there's very limited resources. Ours is one of probably 3 or 4 research projects that I know of around the world that are focused specifically on this question, not just the anti-privatization question, but how do you build a good public service? And so there's very few research projects dedicated to that. The good news is that there are growing numbers. A lot of NGOs, labor unions, I work a lot with public sector unions, growing public support, again, and that's across the ideological spectrum. Conservatives, progressives who, for various reasons are critical of privatization. But again, their notion of what you replace it with is very different, right? What kind of public entity are you going to replace that with? And there is a growing field of research. University of Edinburgh has a fantastic research base on remunicipalization, if you're looking for a great data set on that. And there's a lot more to come. With all these contracts ending, I think a growing awareness of the problems of privatization, private firms leaving early because they're not making profits. And so, I always say to people, even if getting rid of the private people is not on the immediate horizon, it might be in unexpected ways. And many, many cities and places have found themselves suddenly, the multinational corporation just got up and left. Like this happened in Buenos Aires. They just left, and suddenly the city had to figure out, oh my God, we need to run a public service here. How are we going to do this? And nobody had thought about it, right? So it's really important, I think, to prepare for what that future might look like. I was going to show you this short video, but I'm out of time. If you Google this, Future is Public, we had a conference in Montreal a few years ago talking about, what does this look like in the Canadian context? And it was a really great dynamic kind of meeting, and there's a bunch of the videos and stuff up there on this website that you can have a look at. And there is a growing movement in Canada. There's a growing movement to build public banks, reintroduce postal banking in Canada, right? So that everybody has access to a retail publicly owned bank in post office outlets. The biggest bank in Japan is their postal bank, publicly owned, right? Germany has a similar kind of system. So lots of countries in the world have public banking, state-owned, transparent, democratic kinds of institutions. So there is a movement in the Canadian context, but I would say overall our political parties are moving in the opposite direction. I spend my time looking at the problems of privatization and reversing that. And here in Canada, we're moving forward in a very aggressive way to continue to privatize healthcare, water, the LCBO, you name it. Everything's on the chopping block in the Canadian context. So it's frankly pretty depressing kind of situation. But there is a growing movement in the Canadian context as well for not just anti-privatization, but what do we want? What does our healthcare system look like, right? We know it's not been good for racialized people, for Indigenous people. How do we create a better public healthcare system in this country? And what does that look like? And you can't move that way if you're not willing to be critical of what we have and not just being critical of privatization. And there's our website if you want to find stuff. So thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks so much, David. That was a great tour d'horizon of your research. I see one hand. We've got about almost 15 minutes, so can we take 2 or 3 questions at once, and then we'll hand it back to you. So please identify yourself at the back. Yes?
Just like wondering.
Can you identify yourself, please?
Thomas. And
Are you in a department?
and like, wondering, you mentioned that Republicans in the U.S. are like privatizing, or sort of like publicizing the utilities. It's kind of like very surprising to me, and like I'm wondering what messaging are they using, if you're aware, like because like I think in Florida I heard that they're not saying climate change. Republicans are saying coastal resilience in order to kind of like make the fortify the coastal areas that prepare for climate change, because they don't want the messaging around climate change. They don't want to fight that, so they're just calling it by a different name. So what are Republicans in these municipalities you're studying, like what are they calling it? Because they could be accused of socialism, so they don't want to do that. So what are they messaging they're using?
Okay.
Okay, thank you for that. I saw a hand over here. Yes? Identify yourself, please.
Hi, hello, I'm Matheus Azevedo from the Department of Applied Math here at and I have a question about what you explained on your very first slide. Corporatization, right? So there seems to be a paradox when talking about lack of accountability caused by corporatization. As you explained to me, I'm very out of my depth with this presentation, but it seems that accountability is one of the prime reasons for corporatization, right? We need to better accountability of the services and of the spending. So how do you go from one state to another?
Okay, thank you. One more question. Yes, Ahmed?
Yes.
Can you identify yourself, please?
Yes, I'm from the Master's of Development Practice program here in the Faculty of Environment. This question isn't directly related to the Canadian context, but I just wanted your take on this. Basically, the Saudi Arabian government, as part of their Vision 2030, they are trying to diversify their economic engine. So they started 2 water desalination plants. One is part of the Red Sea project, the other is part of the NEOM project, Innova. So initially they started that basically Saudi Arabia doesn't have any inland water bodies. So they decided, okay, we'll just take the water from our coast and desalinate it for public consumption. Now their messaging is that we are going to make these into tourist destinations. So I'm wondering, where does the public good in that come from?
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, that'll be the end of the first round of questions, and then we'll take a second round.
Sure, great questions. The Republican message is money. You save money, pure and simple. And so I mentioned Monterey, California. I interviewed the head of their water entity there, and he'd come from a background in engineering and private finance, and he was tasked with, there was a referendum, and the citizens said, we want to make our water operator public. It had always been in private hands. And remember, most water services started off privately owned in the 1800s, when we talk about quote unquote modern water services, right? They were all privately owned. I'm sure it was true here. It was the case in Kingston. And it was in the late 1800s, early 1900s that everything was municipalized for the first time. The City of London, for example, in the UK had 9 private water operators. It was chaos, as you can imagine, right? And cholera was the big turning point, and the city government of London said, this is ridiculous. We need a single publicly operated service provider. And it was largely for efficiency reasons. It was cheaper for the city to run its own municipal service. And so when you look at the literature from 100 years ago, during the initial municipalization wave, it's remarkably similar to today. And a lot of that was around just fiscal conservancy. It's cheaper to do it in-house. And that's exactly what this guy from California said. He came in skeptical. He was tasked with this, but then he said, it took him 5 minutes to realize, yeah, we're going to save money day one, including a $500 million loan. They're going to finance that loan, buy back all the infrastructure, and on day one, save money for the ratepayers of Monterey. That's basically what's going on. He's also been convinced that it's good for democratic reasons, it's good for urban planning reasons, et cetera. So, it's kind of interesting to see some of those, and there hasn't been enough research on this, to be honest, on the Republican side. Almost all the research on remunicipalization has been done on sort of progressive social democratic kinds of initiatives like in Paris. And so, I'm wanting to actually look more at the Republican-oriented conservative side of things and what is it that motivates them and does it change them? Like this guy has said, now I'm a convert, like I'm opposed to privatization. He was a pro-privatizer beforehand. But money is what convinces people, first and foremost. The corporatization, great question. And that's exactly the tension, right? So that's why you want potentially to have corporatization, is to give that arm's length accountability. Give managers the option to make decisions based on what makes sense for the public that they're serving, for their unit, and not to have interference by short-term politicians who might have a political agenda, whatever that may be, right? But if that arm's length distance is too far or not accountable enough, then you've got people that run their own fiefdoms and they're not even they're not elected, right? And how do you discipline and make them accountable? So, if nothing else, again, this point I'm saying, there's no perfect public model. It's a messy world, institutionally, ideologically, financially. So if people think there's going to be some kind of magic formula for public services, forget it. So it's always a balance. What degree of autonomy do you want to give managers? How do you rein that in? What sort of mechanisms do you put in place? So you've hit one of the central tensions right on the head, and that's always a balance. And what that looks like in Buenos Aires as opposed to Toronto, as opposed to Lagos, they're going to be different, and it's based on a whole range of factors. The Indian case, I can't speak specifically to that. But let's remember the kind of development agenda of states. Again, there's nothing inherently good about it, because even if it's publicly funded or publicly driven, most public water services benefit the middle class. They don't benefit low-income households. And so, the first question to ask is who's benefiting from that investment? Desalinization is an incredibly expensive process. Moving water is an incredibly expensive process. From what you've told me, I could be 99% sure that you're basically using public money to subsidize private, relatively well-off households and private interests, right? So, the first question I always ask is public for who and by who, and who's spending money and who's benefiting from this. And that, follow the money. That has to be the central kind of thing. And so, most public services in the world still benefit a relatively privileged elite. And that's what we need to change.
All right, thanks. In some ways, it sounds like you're arguing beyond binary, right? It's really like shifting the methodology, away from the method, public or private. And what's the goal, right? What do we want, right? And it's hard because in the Canadian context, when we think of public, we usually think of, public goods that are mostly realized, right? And we take good government for granted. But most of my MDP students here, when you say government, they run for the hills, right? So, so if we shift away from public or private toward outcomes, I think is what you're encouraging us, then maybe that helps, right? Like I think you said to the question here about corporatized, like how much of autonomy, which is a completely different question, isn't it? Right? You had a question. Can you identify yourself, please?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Kirti. I'm from the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. Firstly, thank you for the great lecture. It gives a very different perspective from what we're usually used to. My question is about so water utilities that may be owned by the municipality or the local government, but is run and operated by, let's say, a private entity. So where does that sort of model, and I know it's there in Canada, but it's also there elsewhere in the world. It seems to be a pretty common model where a water utility is run by a private entity. So where does that fit in this public movement? So is it pro-public? Does it have some sense of corporatization?
So that would fall broadly under this public-private partnership framework. And I mean, that can be, you could have a one-year contract for people that go out and read water meters. That's a form of privatization. You could have a 10 to 15 to 20-year concession, which is the sort of the French model. You can have a 75-year joint venture, where it's almost 50-50 ownership of the private company. That's sort of the Spanish model. And everything in between. You can find good examples of these things. But generally speaking, and we're now 40 years into the privatization experiment, even people in favor of privatization will now openly admit, including the World Bank, that it doesn't save any money. It's no more efficient for a whole range of reasons, not the least of which is profit-taking, but also just managing all these contracts, right? I bet you the city of Waterloo probably has 30 to 40 contracts that it manages at any given time. In Kingston, we have 11 companies, contracts just for waste management. It's incredibly expensive and time-consuming. So, critiquing privatization, it's not inherently bad. It's not that, it's not that people in the private companies are bad. I think they honestly, genuinely want to do the right thing. But it just fragments decision-making. It siphons off public money to private interests. It disincentivizes against long-term planning and long-term infrastructure. And in the water sector, we put pipes in the ground for 100, 150 years. We're digging up pipes in Kingston right now that were put in the ground 150 years ago, some of which are actually old tree trunks, believe it or not, hollowed out tree trunks. And so, is a company with a 20-year contract really interested in investing in infrastructure that's going to last 100 plus years? So there are inherent contradictions in this model. Is it the end of the world if you contract out water meter reading for 6 months? But that's a kind of it's an insidious kind of thing that then the next thing, and this is what happened with waste management in Kingston. We farmed out some of it, and then we farmed out and now suddenly almost everything's privatized. And so research matters, empirics matter, does this work or not? And that's increasingly why people are remunicipalizing, because 20 years down the road, they're like, this isn't working for us. So, that's why research does matter. And I do get frustrated with colleagues who just say, all privatization is inherently bad and they're evil people. Well, let's be a little more nuanced than that. And similarly, just because something's public, it doesn't mean it's going to be good. So we have to be willing to be critical on both sides.
Right, thanks for that. I mean, I think we're out of time, and I feel like that's a good point to end by saying research matters, empirics matter, because if you're going to make a case to decision makers, you got to show them the money, right? You have to show them the votes, right? The people are going to get water, they'll vote for you. So, yeah, research matters. And I think that echoes the main mantra of everybody in this room. So thanks very much, David.
Thank you.